I'm so excited to be here. I do this every opportunity that I have, whether there are 2 people or 2,000 people in the room. So to see all of you here this afternoon just thrills me. My intention for today is really to ensure that this becomes much more of a conversation than it does my standing up here and talking to you for the next hour. And so I always start, and it certainly feels like I need to do this probably less in a group like this than when I'm talking to a group of university students or high school students, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so anytime I start a presentation like this, I just, of course, start it by saying to each of you that I'm going to be sharing some very intimate and personal details of myself. I'm also going to ask that we create a space where we are able to come together and talk very fluidly and openly and honestly about our own experiences, whether it be direct experiences, experiences of a loved one, experiences of those that we work with. And so I'll just ask each of you to really be committed to both me and one another this afternoon in ensuring that we all feel respected and safe as we begin to share this afternoon. So if we could just make sure that cell phones are either off or on vibrate, that would be wonderful. I tend to blab quite a bit. 1 hour is a bit tough for me. I'm going to do my very best. I will ensure that I stay afterward for a few minutes. Sometimes there are questions or conversations that need to be had individually rather than in a group, and so I always ensure that I've got some time to stick around at the end in order to be able to have those conversations one-on-one. So feel free to come and chat with me over at the table afterward if either we don't get to a question or you'd like to have one-on-one interaction. So we'll begin. Anytime I do this presentation, no matter whether it's a group of very seasoned professionals or a group of people that know very little about domestic violence, or it could be a group of people that are survivors of domestic violence and are continuing to really find themselves in their healing process, I always start by sharing quite a bit about myself. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is that I have no PhD, right? What makes me an expert in this subject is that I've lived it, I've walked it, I've experienced it, and I've talked to a whole lot of people that have done so as well. And so it's important that I share a little bit about myself and my background for 2 reasons. One is that it helps us to really sort of get over the hurdles or humps that we have when it comes to our own misconceptions about who this happens to, how it happens, why it happens. And the other piece of this is that I then get to use my own experience as we begin the presentation and give examples of sort of how this applies to those that you're working with or that you know and love. So the first thing that I do in a presentation like this is talk a little bit about where I come from. We know, most of us know, because we're professionals in the room, that there is no real description around who this happens to, right? What this looks like. Many people in the general public, and even some of us that have some experience working with clients in the field, continue to operate from a place of misconception. And so it's going to be important that we begin today's conversation by getting rid of some of that. 1 in 4 of us experience domestic violence physically. 1 in 3 of us experience domestic violence either from a verbally or emotionally abusive place. And so it doesn't matter what we look like, where we come from, our socioeconomic status, our religious affiliation, the color of our skin, right? And so I could be anybody standing up here today. I could look like anybody. I could come from any sort of background. I could have any kind of religious affiliation. And there is absolutely no determination as to whether I or one of you will begin to experience domestic violence. And so the most important reason that those of us that are working with survivors really ingest that information is that even for me, who runs support groups now all over the country, I continue to have to fight some of my own misconceptions about who might be walking through the door and what their needs might be, right? And so as we start this afternoon, let's just begin to sort of think about and talk about the fact that this really is faceless and nameless, and that ultimately 1 in 3 of us, if we were to count off, are going to experience this personally in our lifetime if we haven't already. I come from a upper middle class background. My mom was a social worker, my dad an attorney. In fact, we laughed in our house that one of my first words at the age of 3 was inappropriate. We used to talk all the time about thoughts and feelings and emotions and all sorts of things in our house. In fact, I would tell you, as with my brother, that we probably talked about it a whole lot more often than what we would have liked growing up. I will also tell you that my dad, who became an attorney a little bit later in life, was very much about education and success and academia, right? And that the way that we determine our value and the way that we identify success is in the college that we go to and ultimately then the work that we do. And so I now know a lot of things about myself that I may have not really known as I was this big, and that is that I've never really fit into that mold. And so as I became a toddler and then a child and then a pre-adolescent, I was constantly struggling to feel as though I was worthy enough and lovable enough and valuable enough to my dad and wanted nothing more than that. So I remember instances at 3 or 4 or 5 years old as he is encouraging me to become bilingual in Spanish, where I'm sitting with my tutor and coloring on her carpet rather than learning how to say sí or no, right? And here comes my brother 6 years later, who I absolutely hated for all sorts of reasons, really primarily just because he existed. Basically born reading encyclopedias, and I'm not. And so I think what happened for me, and I couldn't have told you this then, or I don't even know that I could have told you this 10 years ago. What began to happen for me as I was a small child is that I think that I started to believe before my brother came along that my dad was just kind of loving me the best way he knew how in my little 6-year-old mind, right? That this was just kind of who dad was. And so I sort of learned how to tolerate him, he learned how to tolerate me, and I learned what I needed to do in order to be able to seek his love and attention, right? I could lie about getting an A on a spelling test, and he would adore me. I could come home and tell him about all of the wonderful things I learned when really I didn't care about any of it all at all, and receive the attention from him that I was so desperate for. However, when my brother came along and they start playing ball in the driveway and having conversations about the fact that my brother is going to be the president of the United States at 7, I am busy throwing roller skates at his head, while my dad is busy really loving him and adoring him in the very way that I was absolutely desperate for. And so something shifted for me then. And what shifted for me was that I began to believe that this wasn't about my dad just loving me the best way that he knew how, that he was absolutely capable of loving me in all of the ways that I was desperate for, and he was choosing not to love me in this way because I was witnessing him have this whole different interaction with my brother, and my brother was being loved and adored and cherished in all of the ways that I was seeking so desperately, right? And so, therefore, I began to believe that there must be something wrong with me. I'm not worthy enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not lovable enough, I'm not fun enough, I'm not into all of the things that interest my dad, and therefore it is going to be my life's work to ensure that somehow I figure out how to become what he needs me to be in order to feel the love and attention of the one man in my life that I'm desperate for, right? And so if we just stop there and sort of think about our own experiences, this was so unintentional, right? My dad didn't realize what he was saying to me non-verbally, and he didn't understand the messages that I was ingesting or looking at the differences between the way that he treated me or my brother. He was doing the best that he could, and he had a different connection with my brother than he had for me. But what I began to realize then, unconsciously, and what I certainly realize now, is that we start receiving messages from the time that we're this big, right? Good messages, not so good messages, messages of truth, messages that aren't based in truth, about who we are, where our value comes from, what we're worth, what we should be looking for in relationship, what success means, how it's defined, what friendship looks like, what it means to be in an unconditionally lovable relationship, right? We start learning these things from the time we're this big. And so, if we can sort of think about that for the moment, and then sort of think about what that meant for us as we transitioned into early adolescence, and how that shaped us as we entered into relationship, we will all have the opportunity to identify that ultimately we started to seek out people that were really feeding us all of the messages that we already believed to be true about ourselves, right? Because that's what was comfortable, that's what made sense for us. So I'm going to share some parts of my story, not all of it, for the sake of time. And then I'm going to use parts of that story as we move through the presentation to give you examples, and we'll have some conversation about your experiences and what you see and where you have questions. And I will say that one of the things that I am most clear about is that as I grew into an adolescent and became interested in relationship, that the moment that anybody started to pay attention to me and share with me that they saw value in me, I was all about it, right? And so that's true for most of us, especially as young adolescent women. But for those of us that have grown up not really feeling like we fit in and desperate for the love or attention, feelings of unconditional value from a parent, especially our dads, we are really set up to extend sort of those thoughts or feelings around this desperation in a way that some of us others aren't. And so as I entered high school and entered into a serious relationship that was all-consuming from day one, it felt incredible, right? He needed me. He wanted me. He thought I was beautiful. He wanted to spend every moment with me. He wanted me to call him before I went to school. He wanted me to call him the moment I got home from school. He wanted all of our weekend time to be spent together. He didn't want me to hang out with Betsy or Susie because they were no good for me, right? Or Betsy dressed like a hoe, Susie was a liar, I'm not a liar, and he certainly didn't want me to be perceived as one, and so therefore I needed to be much more careful about who I was in friendship with. And so what started to happen is that he kind of decided for me, and I certainly concurred, that maybe none of my friends were really any good for me, right? And that ultimately all I really needed was him. Red flag number one, right? But for a young woman who is desperate for attention and seeking approval and is just soaking in these feelings of being needed and wanted and seen and beautiful, there was no room for any question about the grooming process that was beginning to happen, right? And so this relationship that was all-consuming from the very beginning, it was possessive, it was jealous, it was controlling, it was intense, and it felt incredible, really set me up to continue to play out what was already going on in my young life. I was going to prove to him at any cost that I could be trusted, that I could be the woman that he needed and wanted, that I could be a good enough girlfriend, that I could be everything to him that he needed me to be, even if it meant forsaking the little bit of self-esteem that I might have had as I entered into this relationship. And so there was no physical abuse for the first 2.5 years of our relationship. It got much more controlling, it got much more isolating, there was constant arguing, but nobody in my house was really talking about what healthy relationships look like, or convincing me that ultimately there was a problem in this relationship, in conjunction with the fact that I was doing a really good job of covering up whatever pieces of my relationship were dysfunctional, right? We all do that as teenagers. And so the first time that there was actually an abusive incident, no one knows anything about that, right? And the first time that I actually experienced physical abuse was about 2.5 years into the relationship. And I was studying sociology. And so I was beginning to learn about social problems and dysfunctional relationship and a little bit about domestic violence. And the way that we defined domestic violence at that time was by bruises, right? By hitting and by stalking and by ending up in the hospital, and ultimately these women who were involved in these violent relationships could potentially die. And so I learned all about that stuff. But nobody was really talking much about the cycle of violence or red flags and warning signs or verbal or emotional abuse. And so I wasn't connecting with or relating to anything that I was learning about, which made it all the more confusing when this first physical violent episode occurred. I had moved back to go to school in San Diego. I had been sent away to Los Angeles. My parents said, you cannot go to school in San Diego County. I now believe it was because they wanted me as far away from this relationship as they could get me in order to begin to have different life experience, as close to San Diego as I possibly could, in order to make it easier for me, and was back and forth really most days. I would drive back to his apartment and then back to school at 5 a.m. and do the same thing over and over again, because it wasn't worth fighting with him about who I was sleeping with at school, where I was spending time, who my friends were, which dorm I had ended up in, right? And it had gotten so controlling and possessive that he would actually clock the miles on my car and feel the hood on my car, so that if it were still warm when he got back from football practice, he would know that I hadn't in fact been there for the half hour that I should have been based on traffic, and I had stopped to screw someone along the way. So I decided that it was much easier for me to come back to San Diego. And when my dad got sick with cancer, it was a perfect opportunity for me to do so. And I said to my parents, please let me come home. I'll live on campus, I'll have this great college experience, I'll get involved with all sorts of activities, it'll be just like I'm away, I promise, but I really want to be with you and Dad and my brother. And so they hemmed and hawed and they said, okay. The first episode of physical violence that I alluded to a few minutes ago happened on that campus when I returned back to San Diego. I called him one evening after the 3 young women that I was supposed to be rooming with said, Jess, you haven't been here one single night. We've never had an overnight with you. You're fun, you're wonderful, you're really funny, you're lots of fun to be around. We just want one night with you. And I decided, man, that sounds like a really good idea. I hadn't had any socialization with any young women in probably about 2 years. So I called him on the phone and I said, listen, I've got a terrible headache, because it certainly wasn't going to fly that I say to him I'd like to hang out with my friends. I've got a terrible headache, I don't feel well, I'm in my dorm room, you know how to find me, I'll see you at 8 o'clock in the morning. And he said, like hell you are. And I said to him, I'm not doing this today. This is craziness. I don't feel well, you've got the phone number, I'm not going anywhere, call me day or night, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Click. About an hour and a half later, there's a knock on the dorm room door. I now know that he's proceeded to knock on 125 dorm room doors until finding mine, because I had never spent a single night on campus. The door opens, and there are 2 boyfriends of the 3 girls that are in the room. We're watching movies, they're playing cards, we've got popcorn. He walks in, excuse my language, there will be some during this presentation, and says, which one of you is fucking my girlfriend? I am mortified, right? I have the opportunity to finally enter into friendship with these 3 young women who think that not only he, but I, must be absolutely nuts, right? And so the 2 young men that are in the room step forward and say, dude, who are you and what are you talking about? I then drag him out of the dorm room apartment because I am absolutely mortified. And he has me by my neck in the hallway. And he basically says, "You no good slut. I knew you were up to no good. And you will not sleep tonight until you tell me which one of these two dudes you were screwing." And so he takes me back to his apartment. And it's 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm starting to doze off. And he's pulling me up by my hair and saying to me, "I told you you're not going to sleep tonight until you tell me which one of these two guys you're screwing." Finally, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, we both fall asleep. By 9 a.m., I wake up and I am clear about one thing. I don't know a whole lot about relationship. I don't have a whole lot of self-esteem or self-worth. He's now put his hands on me, and I know enough to know that that's not okay. So I wake up with the intention of saying, "You've crossed the line, and I'm out of here," right? But before I can say that, he too wakes up and he has tears streaming down his face. "Oh my God, Jess, I think I have an alcohol issue. I've been drinking way too much. You know, my dad's an alcoholic. I've been crazy, out of control, the football party scene. I drank way too much last night. I don't remember a whole lot of what's happened. I'm certain that it's due to the alcohol. We've been together 2.5 years and this has never happened before. Don't you think if I was an abuser that this would have happened way before now? We've had fights way worse than this. It's got to be contributed to the alcohol. You so don't deserve this. Your dad's dying. You have no one else. I know that. I need to continue to show up for you, right? I'm going to go to AA. I'm going to go to counseling. I'm going to stop drinking. And if this happens ever again, I will open the door for you and suggest that you walk out because you deserve so much more." And here I am in my 20-year-old mind, right? He's right. This has never happened before. We've been together 2.5 years. And I know enough about domestic violence, right, because I've been learning about it, that typically the first episode, if it's going to happen, happens pretty quickly. And none of what I have experienced is what's being talked about. And my dad's dying, and I have no other support. He is now the only man in my life that is going to give me this sense of value and worth that I have been desperate for my entire life. And my mom has no capacity to really be there for me emotionally, and the few friends that I had the opportunity to potentially be in a relationship with, I know now want nothing to do with me. One more chance, and if it ever happens again, I'm gone. I leave that afternoon with the intention of him going to AA and getting some help, and me taking some time to sort of really think about what this relationship is going to look like for me, right? And he's now on his best behavior. Go have a turkey sandwich with Susie. Stay after class if you want to with Betsy, right? For the next few months, it's all good. And I'm now able to say to myself, wow, this really is an alcohol issue, right? It's all about the alcohol, and as long as he's not drinking, we're good. My dad passes away. I'm 20 years old. My parents have been married about 27 years. I have a 13-year-old brother at home. My mom is devastated. My dad was 46 years old. 5 weeks later, I find out I'm pregnant. And I go to my mom and I say, "Mom, guess what?" And she says, "Oh God, Jess, no." And I say to her, "It's gonna be fine. We've got it figured out. I'm gonna continue in school. I'm gonna graduate. I'm gonna be able to provide for this kid. My relationship, we're all better. We're gonna get married. We're gonna do what's right for this baby, and we'll show you." And she basically says, "I love you, and I have no capacity to deal with this right now," right? And so, as I walk away from that dinner exchange with her, what has just happened is that I am now isolated from the one other person that may have been able to show up for me, right? I am now solely reliant on this young man, not just emotionally, but now financially and biologically, right? So things are okay during my pregnancy. He's stressed out because of the financial responsibility. I am this big at a Catholic university, so I decided I'd better move off campus, right? I wasn't the most popular girl in town. And so we moved into a studio apartment, just he and I. It was like $450 a month. And he's stressed out, I'm stressed out. I'm nannying part-time to make ends meet. He's part-time security, and we're doing our very best. And so he comes home pissed off that I made leftovers for dinner, and a good wife doesn't do that, or that the floor wasn't vacuumed well enough, or that I had spent too long outside, or where the hell was I if I just went to get the mail? It doesn't take 10 minutes to get the mail, right? But no physical incident. And in sociology class, I was learning that for those that are in serious domestic violence relationships, that typically during pregnancy, things escalate. And so it wasn't happening for me in my house, and therefore I had reason to believe that things were going to be all good. He starts drinking a little more, finding bottles in the cabinets. He's attributing it to stress, but I can handle it. I'm not going back to where I was. Things will be fine. It's none of your business. My son's born. We're now married because it's the right thing to do, and I want to give him the best opportunity that I can as a two-parent family at 21 years old. At about 3 months old, the violent incidents begin to resurface and continue in a way that really requires me to step into the house each moment of the day, not knowing what I'm going to be heading into, and and moving into sort of this place of survival, right? So backhanded because the floor had dirt on it, or backhanded because my son spilled his juice cup, or on the floor with his hands around my neck because he was sure that instead of getting up in the middle of the night to feed my son, I had actually met my boyfriend at the door. And he'd clock my miles to and from school, and he'd be waiting for me in the parking lot. And he had cameras in the apartment so he could see me going to do laundry to and from. And so as I started to realize what I was living in and what I was happening and what my son was starting to respond to, I had moments where I thought, I gotta get out of here. But how? I'm financially dependent on this guy. I have no friends. My family has basically said, we love you unconditionally, but this is now your responsibility. I'm being watched and held hostage. If I even wanted to leave, how in the world would I do that? Until one day, when my son was about 1.5 years old, and he went after me with a closed fist and ended up hitting my son in the face instead, and he started to bleed. And that was my moment. We all have a moment, those of us that have survived abuse, where I knew that I'd rather die than allow my son to live another moment in that situation. So the next morning I had it all planned out. I had my big laundry basket going to do laundry, and I could feel him peeking through the blinds, which is actually the cover of the book that's out on the table today. And he was looking through the blinds, watching me do laundry, and I dropped it in the middle of my apartment complex. And I left my son in the apartment because he certainly wouldn't have allowed me to go out to do laundry with him. He would have known that something was up. And I prayed, even if I didn't know who God was, where he was at in all of this, please allow me the opportunity to come back and get him. And so I dropped the laundry basket, ran as fast as I could to the apartment manager, banging on her door, let me in, let me in. She finally does, and I burst out as quickly as I can. You've got to hide me, and you've got to call the police. Go into her closet, she locks the door, what's going on? I explain to her, please, please, my husband's basically holding me hostage, I've been abused, my son's in the apartment, call the police. 3 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. I know she's in there! And he's screaming, and I am shaking inside this closet. He finally goes away, the police come, they escort me back to the apartment to get my son. We grab maybe 3 articles of clothing and flee to the one friend that I have left, who I've known since I was 5 years old. She knew that I was coming the moment that I had the opportunity. Show up at her house, file for divorce and a restraining order. And there was then about 3 or 4 months where, for all sorts of reasons, I felt like we may be able to make this work, right? He's now determined that he has a mental health diagnosis and he's gonna get on meds. And that ultimately he has returned to drinking, and that was the root of the cause in the first place. So we went back and forth for a few months, which certainly for those of us that have been in this dynamic understand. For those that haven't been, it is impossible to figure out as to why, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So I finally figured out that he wasn't changing, nothing was changing, and ultimately I was subjecting not just myself, but most importantly at that time, my child, to this ongoing chaos, and I was out of here for good. Filed for custody, there was back and forth with that, and at that time, the court said unless he is being severely abusive to your child, he has just as much right to him as you do, right? And so my son is now starting to talk at 2.5 years old. Please, mommy, no go. Daddy hurts, daddy hits. And I'm vomiting on the side of the road, literally, as I'm having to hand him off. And so we spend about 6 months exchanging at my mom's house until he breaks down her door because he's pissed off about a conversation that he overhears between she and a relative. And then we move to the police station, and the police are saying, Ms.Yaffa, don't you think you're overreacting? We're here 3 times a week. This is craziness. And I'm feeling like an absolute idiot. There was one incident where he followed me from the police station on a one-way street because he was pissed off that I showed up in a new or used vehicle, and I must be screwing someone in order to get the money in order to be able to afford that. And so he follows me on the one-way road and turns around and head-on collides into my car and is attempting to pull me out of the driver's side window. I'm gonna kill you! And I had my first cell phone, which was this big, you remember those, calling 911, and the whole thing's recorded, and my son's in the back seat, and he goes off to jail. And he calls me about 3 months into this stint collect and basically says, I see the error of my ways. I now recognize that we will not be together. I get it. But I now need to commit to being a better parent for this child. And so I didn't really believe him, right? I had reason not to. But I felt like if I was going to be forced to parent with this person, ultimately I had to give him the opportunity to do better because my son deserved it. And so he gets out of jail, and we spend the next 6 months in a supervised visitation situation where he goes in one door and I go in the other, and they have their time together and we part ways. And he was very well behaved, no real incident. He might have ranted and raved about this or that, but he was on pretty good behavior. And so at the end of this 6 months, the court says, we're done paying for this, you guys figure it out. And I decided the safest thing that I can do for my son is to begin to allow him to have visitation at his family's house because there was always someone there. At least he would feel a bit protected. His cousins might be there, he could play, he'd be distracted. So we do that for a few months, and things are relatively okay, so much so that I could actually spend a few minutes there on certain days chatting it up with him, talking about what he's doing in preschool or what he's learning or how potty training's going. And as far as I'm concerned, this is as good as it's going to get, right? We're in a pretty okay place. I graduated school, I had started working a really good job, I was supporting my son on our own. I was in all sorts of relationships, an absolute hot mess, right? Because if I had zero self-esteem beforehand, I certainly had none now. And so I was dating Tom, Dick, and Harry, sometimes simultaneously, in order to fill the void. And so as far as I was concerned, I was in really great shape. On one particular occasion, he called me and said, listen, I've been working under the table. You haven't been getting child support money. I know you've been working really hard to support him. Come over and get it. And I said to him, I've got 15 minutes between work appointments. I can't be late. I'll meet you at your parents' house, because I knew better than to be alone. Drive over there. He opens the door, starts to make small talk, and I can smell alcohol on his breath. And there go my sirens, right? Ding, ding, ding. And so I'm trying to exit as quickly as I can. Okay, I gotta go. Nice seeing you. If you could just grab that money, that would be great. And he puts me in a bear hug. And I, at the time, was 100 pounds maybe due to the stress, although I'm not much more than that now. And he was 220-ish, and he's got me in a bear hug. I've missed you, and you're doing such a good job with our son, and you look so good, and you're so successful, and I know that your boyfriend doesn't feel as good as I do, and all sorts of craziness, and the alcohol is just spewing from his pores. And I am now in panic mode, trying to get out of this situation. I gotta go. And he proceeds to drag me around the corridor and throws me onto the ground and has me by my neck and by my legs pinned down, as well as my arms with his elbows, and there's a condom next to me on the floor. And I know that this bastard has planned this whole thing. And he proceeds to brutally rape me from head to toe that day, attack me, sodomize me, rape me. I spent about a half hour negotiating with him, bloody and half-dressed, after the experience to please let me out. I know that it must have been a mistake. I'm sure you thought it was consensual. I must have given you mixed messages. I promise this won't affect your relationship with our son, because I had to say whatever I could to get out of there. Drive myself to the work appointment that I was petrified being late for because I couldn't afford to lose my job. Disheveled and a mess and tearful with bruises. And she says to me, Jessica, are you okay? And I brush it off. I'm fine. Drive myself to the police station, pick up the phone and ask my neighbor, can you please pick up my son from preschool? There's been an incident. Spend the next 12 hours or so at the police department and then the hospital. We end up on the trial stand after they go pick him up. Spend 6 months on trial, and he is found guilty of all 14 counts, and he's serving a 29-year prison sentence. He's been incarcerated since February 2001. He will be incarcerated until August 25th, 2025. My then 4-year-old is now almost 18 and heading off to college. Wow. And I will tell you that it wasn't until about 7 or 8 years ago that I recognized that although the world thought that I was doing really well, right? I was making a living for myself, my son was doing okay, everything looked great from the outside, that I was still really suffering on the inside. I went from one therapist to the next who just wanted me to relive my trauma. No good for me, right? Let's talk about these episodes. Absolutely not. So I decided that I wanted nothing to do with therapy, and I was still looking for my value to be filled by other people. So I would date anybody in my vicinity in order to be able to fill, at least temporarily, the hole that if it was this big when I entered into a relationship, was now this big. Also decide simultaneously that my son needs a mentor because he's really struggling at the time. So here comes this wonderful guy in his life. They have a terrific relationship. My son's behavior starts to improve. I have about 30 seconds where I'm not seeing anybody, and so I say to his mentor, I'm single, you're single, we should give this a shot. So we get together. Well, I decide a few months into this that he is far too straight-laced and boring for me. No drama, no crazy, I don't know what to do with this. So I say to him, not really into you, this isn't really working out between us. You can continue to have a relationship with my son because that's so good for him, but I'm pulling the plug on this relationship thing. And he is devastated, right? And he starts talking to me about his God. And I say to him, dude, I'm a Jewish girl, want nothing to do with your Bible thumping butt. Step off, you're all over my boundaries. And if you can't cut this out, I'm gonna have to pull the plug on this relationship as well. And for months, he's writing me these long emails about how I'm broken and I'm deserving of unconditional love, and that it's not in the men that I'm seeking or anywhere else in the world, right? And that ultimately, he's gonna continue to show up for me because God has called him to. And I am saying, you are driving me crazy. Well, about 7 months into this soiree, I get fired from my current job, which was a really great job because I was dating my boss, one of my finer moves. He also gets gets fired, and I'm now devastated, and go to this one person who is the mentor of my son, who has been a constant and talking to me about my value and my worth, and it's not out there, it's in here, and blah, 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 blah. And share to him what's just happened, and with him what's just happened, and he says, Jess, I'm trying to tell you, you've dated all of these people, and you're looking for it outside of yourself, and it's not there, and I'm broken too. We're all broken, but let's talk about where this really comes from. Have lunch with me. And if it doesn't make sense at the end of this lunch, I will walk away and never speak another word about you and I being together or my being the parent of your child. And I'm like, lunch? I've been dealing with 9 months of this. I can get through 45 minutes. Absolutely. So we go to lunch. By the end of this lunch, I have tears streaming down my face saying, thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for waiting for me. I decide, all right, I'll try this church thing out. I don't even know about this God thing. It's important to you. I'll hold your hand. That's what you want. We go. 6 weeks later, God is speaking to me about the fact that everything that I have endured is going to be used for good. I don't know anything about this Jesus dude. I don't really even know if God exists, but I'm hearing something and it's crazy, right? 3 months later, I go to this mega church in San Diego, which is the Rock where we had attended, and I say to them, listen, I don't know a whole lot about what's going on here. I don't know a whole lot about any of this, but I feel like maybe I'm called to do something with domestic violence and sexual assault. I'm happy to just show up and be a safe space. And they say, wonderful, we need you. It's the #1 call we get into our call center. So I put out 10 chairs about 4 months later as the application process is approved and pray. 10 ladies, 10 ladies. 68 women show up on that first night. And we have since served about 6,000. We have moved into the place of being our own nonprofit corporation to be able to offer both faith-based and non-faith-based services. We get about 150 phone calls a week. My mentor and I have been married for about 5.5 years. And it was only about 7 years ago, being that I've really been moving through this since 16 years old, that I got to a place where I realized that there was a real difference between just surviving and overcoming and being triumphant, right? And that for a lot of us, even those that are therapists working in the field, that ultimately our goal is to share with our clients or our friends or our daughters or our sisters, you will survive this, right? But in my experience today, and my message has really transformed into one around this concept of being an overcomer and a conqueror and being triumphant, and that we don't just have the responsibility to survive this, we have the responsibility to be triumphant and then extend our hand and say to the person to the right or the left of us, I've been there, I've done it, I know that it's really hard to understand it. Unless you've walked it, you're not alone, you're not crazy, and let's just talk about it, right? No judgment. And so it's been a remarkable journey. And I will say that that doing this work, and you guys get this, has been just as much about my own healing process as it has been about all of the women and men and children that have come through our doors. I will also say that I have to be really careful in the very same ways that you do about boundaries, right? Because when I felt like I was called to do this work, I was misconstrued in that I felt like anyone that God brought to my door, I had to be the answer for, right? And so I took myself out in the first 2 years of doing this work. I was a mess. Panic attacks in bed, couldn't brush my teeth, a crazy mess. Until I realized that that wasn't the intention at all, and that there are lots of people that are doing this work and that believe in this work and that have all sorts of resources that I don't have, that God, I believe, is calling to do bits and pieces along the way, and that if I believe, in fact, that I am supposed to be all things to all people, then I am right back where I was 20 years ago. And so I learned how to do that. And one of the things that is most powerful about this presentation is getting to talk to others about what I've learned, not from being a therapist, but from just offering these safe spaces where literally hundreds of women have come, and what they've said about what is most important to them about the therapeutic process, what's been helpful, what's been hurtful, what is really important for therapists to pay attention to. And so I offer you this information, not because I know any more than you, I just have a different perspective. Does that make sense? So let's breathe for a minute. We usually need to. I'm going to just break for a quick second, answer any questions that you have. Obviously, there is nothing that you can't ask me at this point because I have shared every personal detail of my life. Sometimes people have questions about my son, sometimes people have questions about the work I do, sometimes people have questions about my process or my ex-husband. So if we have any of those questions, let's ask them. If we have those questions that come up along the way, we'll stop and ask them then, and then we'll move into some of this. Any questions? Well, we have to have questions. Yes.
I guess more leading to the work that you do. What is exactly, like you said, you have a nonprofit going on and things like that. What exactly does that entail, I guess?
I would be thrilled to talk about that. I will also say that I was just flat ironed yesterday and I'm sweating up a storm. Day 2 where my flat iron is going to be all I do 2 things. I do lots of things. My 2 primary passions in life are talking about the co-occurrence between trauma and self-medicating our pain away. My ex-husband is an alcoholic and an addict. I feel like I am called to be able to bridge the gap between those that are suffering as a result of drugs and alcohol and those that are suffering as a result of trauma. Those of us that suffer as a result of trauma often turn to drugs and alcohol. Those that are struggling with drugs and alcohol often act out our trauma in an inhibited way and ultimately end up in trouble, right? And so I have the blessed opportunity to be able to sort of do both things. Bonnie mentioned that she and I work with one another. I actually, as of recently, have joined the Practical Recovery Team, which is a non-12-step approach to addiction treatment. And we are really focused on individualized care that meets the person right where they are, whether they're considering, can I manage my drinking or alcohol use? Can I not? It's affecting my functioning, my relationships. I'm not ready to call myself an alcoholic or an addict, but I know I've got some work to do. We, in the last several weeks, have determined that we are going to be in the final stages of developing a program specific to relationship trauma. It is called the Restoration In. REST stands for Renewing and Empowering Survivors of Trauma. And we're actually going to be looking at relationship trauma first and then all of the self-medication that happens as a result. So I get to now, with Practical Recovery alongside me, travel the country because they've given me the opportunity to do that and talk to people that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford me to do so. So universities that have no budget, low-income high schools that have no budget, other treatment centers that don't have a budget, HR departments and organizations that wouldn't otherwise have access to information like this. The nonprofit is completely volunteer run. We run 7 support groups a week from here to Michigan to New York, San Diego, Los Angeles. I run one of those. In addition to that, we get about 150 phone calls a week from survivors that are in crisis. So we diaper babies, we put shoes on women's feet, we get bus passes, we fly people from Los Angeles to Alaska sometimes to find safety. And it is a phenomenal thing. So I've been able to really do both things in such a beautiful way and feel completely fulfilled as a result. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just want to thank you for telling your story with such courage and the raw details, and just so powerful. I just want to acknowledge that and not just launch into. I don't have any questions right now.
I second that.
Yes.
Based on your experience from the time things started until now, how far do you think we've come with law enforcement and other resources in terms of recognizing what predominantly women go through, especially given what was just in the LA Times yesterday about colleges, universities, not investigating for 5 years any reports of rape or abuse?
Yeah. We have come far in some regards. We have a long way to go in others. Women that I work with today have a very different experience with law enforcement and the court system for the most part than I did in 2001, which is a wonderful thing. And then there are areas where there needs to be so much education and information and shift. And so there's still work to do.
Yeah, I would think there'd be a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm noticing that you first mentioned mother at the age of 19 when she, in essence, abandoned you as a child. But what was your relationship with your mother from the very beginning? You were totally focused on your father.
Yeah, good question. My mother is a beautiful woman. My mother was available to me as I was growing up. My mom played a very active role in the life of myself and my brother. It did not matter. It did not matter. For me as a young girl, what I needed, what I sought after, and what was more important to me than anything was the unconditional love and acknowledgement of my dad.
And important second part, what was the relationship between your father and your mother?
Good question. No relationship is perfect, right? They had a relatively good relationship. I understand now my mom's position in that she would back up and support my dad even if it were hurtful to me because that was the right thing to do as a co-parent. I didn't understand it then. I also now know that they had a lot of conversation behind closed doors about what I was missing out on, or what I was feeling like I was needing from him and not getting, and I wasn't privy to those conversations. But she has shared with me since his passing that she recognized that some of that existed for me and that she just didn't know how to handle it other than to talk to him about it.
I do have a comment now.
Okay.
You know, it's funny because I think there's such stigma. Like, I grew up with like a mom that was physically abused multiple times, and I was a women's studies major, and I was in a long-term relationship, and I remember going and hearing this lecture about this woman who was a women's studies major. It was this whole book that had been written, and how her boyfriend, who was abusive and no one knew, it was like this secret thing, he actually murdered her. There was this whole book, and I remember, and at the time I worked in a domestic violence shelter, heard this lecture, and I was in a relationship, and my relationship, even though I had all this knowledge and was smart, very educated, had seen it had shifted to a physical place, and I left, but it was so interesting and to me how, despite all that information, because I was smart and articulate and had all this knowledge, like psychology, sociology, women's studies, but the timing of all of that lecture, and despite working at, you know, I think there's still such stigma around educated women. You know, I had this storyline, even though it was my mom and then working at the shelter, you know, it's just, I think it's such a beautiful thing to expose those stories, because it's not such a narrow group that have that experience. And so I just, the way you revealed your story was so powerful in revealing those pieces. And I think that there's such shame that binds people to not expose those stories, because you don't want to be that person that had that happen, blah, blah, blah. Especially in relationship to DV stuff. So I hope that made sense.
Totally, such an important point. In fact, what I was gonna say is that you have no idea the number of times that I say, let me come talk to you, your church, your college campus, your prestigious organization, your neighborhood, and they say, oh, that's not happening here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Not only thank you, but it's amazing to see you up there doing this. I remember you talking about doing this, and thanks for being an inspiration.